Hey everybody, welcome to SI.com. I'm David Gardner. This is 1 and 1. We're here to talk about college basketball. Today we're going to talk about Gonzaga. Are they a legit Final Four contender? And who is the best freshman not named Jahlil Okafor? I'm joined by SI Associate Editor Ted Keith. Ted, let's start with Gonzaga. It's the closest thing that we're going to get to them playing in a major conference. They played two Pac-12 teams this week. They played Arizona, they lost in overtime, and then they beat UCLA. After watching those two games, what do you think of Gonzaga? Are they a Final Four contender?
I'm not sure that they are yet. I think Final Four contenders don't just play good teams, they beat good teams. And they haven't beaten a team of that caliber yet. And look, maybe the bracket breaks their way for once, but what we've seen of Gonzaga over the past 15 years is that sooner or later they're going to run into a team that has demonstrably better talent than them. Sometimes they don't even get that far, but when they do, they have to show that they can't just hang, that they can win. And they took Arizona to overtime, but that's a charitable way of saying it because they actually had Arizona on the ropes. They should have won that game. They should have been able to close it out, especially when you have a senior point guard like Kevin Pangos, who might be the best point guard in the country, controlling the ball at the end of the game. But Arizona, as some of these better teams I think are able to do, kind of dictate their will on the outcome, especially on the defensive end of the floor. Then you're right. Then they go and beat Washington State, which is sort of a pushover team, power conference team by name only, I think. And then they beat UCLA. And I think UCLA is a fine team. I think in the Pac-12, there will be wins for UCLA to be had that gets them into the NCAA tournament. But UCLA hasn't been all that impressive in the non-conference either. So right now, if you're Gonzaga, you're saying, okay, we're not at the elite level because we can't beat a team like Arizona, but we're better than most. But that's where they've been really for the last 15 years. I want to see them beat one of those big teams during the season that lets us know that come March, you can feel confident about putting them in the Final Four in your bracket.
Yeah, like we talked about after they lost to Arizona under Mark Few, they just haven't beaten a top 10 team. They don't have that signature win. And of course, those are teams from a year ago or 2 years ago, and so you can't compare them to this team. What stands out to me about this team is that their offense is so efficient. Their offense is amazing. You've got 10 players down. If you go down to people who are using even 12% of their offensive possessions and up to 28%, all of them have an offensive rating of over 100. And then you look at their front court of Wiltshire, Zabonis, Karnowski. All of those guys are high volume, high efficiency players. I think they've got a front court that can go up with the best in the country. I think that they can match up with Arizona as they showed, even though they lost that game. I think they could match up with Duke potentially. And if Kentucky loses a few more 7-footers, I think they could possibly match up against them. Where do you see this team ending up?
Well, I think they're going to be a top 10 team just by virtue of the fact that I don't know where the losses are going to come from. That's one of the things we forget about Gonzaga every year is that they do tend to stumble a couple times in the West Coast Conference, which is not a league that's obviously known for anything other than Gonzaga. Occasionally a St. Mary's pops up and has a good team, but this is Gonzaga's conference to lose once again. So they're going to fall off the radar a little bit during conference play, as they always do. We'll notice them because they're not going to lose, but they're not going to be in that national discussion because they're not playing on national television 2 times a week as Kentucky will, as Duke will, as Kansas will, Michigan State, all those teams in the power leagues that we're going to be focusing more on. Then come March, people are going to look at Gonzaga and their ranking and the seeding is going to become a question then. Where do you put this team that doesn't have that really impressive win but ran roughshod, as we probably expect they will, through a conference? I don't know that their ceiling can be much higher than a 3 seed, maybe a 2, depending on what happens elsewhere. But if power conference teams take care of business, Gonzaga is not going to be a 1 seed, which, of course, theoretically gives you the easiest path through the bracket. So they will have their work cut out for them in March, and the trick for them will be being able to not just beat those big teams when they play, but they got to get there too, because they've been tripped up by Wichita State in years past. They've been tripped up by some fellow mid-majors that aren't going to be scared about playing a Gonzaga team either, because they don't have that cachet on a national stage.
Yeah, as you look at the number 1 seeds across the country, it's kind of hard at this point to say that Gonzaga could beat out a team like a Duke, like Arizona, like Kentucky. Those guys are Wisconsin are lined up for the number 1 seeds at this point, and it's hard to imagine that even during conference play, especially a team like Kentucky, when are they going to lose in the SEC?
Yeah.
I don't know that they'll lose a game other than Louisville coming up after Christmas. Yeah. I don't think that they'll lose an SEC game. So, like you said, it's going to be hard to convince me that Gonzaga is a number 1 seed if those teams take care of business in conference play. Speaking of Duke, Jahlil Okafor last night went for 20 and 20 against Elon. I think it's pretty clear at this point in the season that he is the best freshman in the country. He's possibly the best player in the country. I've been doing the weekly Wooden Watch for SI.com, and I've got him at number 2 right behind Frank Kaminsky. But really, I mean, it's neck and neck between those two guys. Let's look at the rest of the freshman class, though. Besides Okafor, who's the best freshman in the country?
Well, first of all, I got to say that you have those rankings mistaken. I think Okafor is the best player in the country right now.
You're not the only one who thinks my rankings are mistaken.
Well, that's not to take anything away from Frank Kaminsky, who's a wonderful player in his own right, but Okafor is a dominant player. Kaminsky's a very good player. Okafor is a dominant player. To me, that tilts the balance toward Okafor. But you're right. We do have to start thinking about this in terms of everybody other than Okafor for freshman of the year, the same way I think we have to think of the rankings as everybody other than Kentucky.
Right.
And it may prove to be that way for the entire season. So for now, I'm looking at guys who've been a little bit off the radar. Still top 10 recruits coming to college, but did not get the same level of hype as someone like a Jahlil Okafor, who was a high school national player of the year. And that's Rashad Vaughn, who's a left-handed shooting guard, plays at UNLV. Came in with a reputation as a great shooter. Hasn't necessarily shown that yet. He's shooting under 30% from three, but averaging over 16 points a game, leading UNLV in scoring. And they're going to go to him because they need scoring in the worst kind of way. So his shots are not going to drop off. So if he ever starts shooting better, we could see him pushing a 20 points per game average in conference play. And that'll certainly get him on the radar screens of not just other coaches and maybe wouldn't watch people around the country, but maybe NBA draft analysts as well.
Yeah, the other freshman that I've included in wouldn't watch is D'Angelo Russell of Ohio State. I don't think that I expected him to be this good this soon. I didn't expect him to be almost as good as Jahlil Okafor. Obviously, you can't compare the two players because Okafor is a post player, Russell's a guard. They score in different ways, but Russell's offensive rating has been nearly 120, and he's taking 30% of the possessions for Ohio State. I didn't realize that they had that much of a scoring void. When you looked at what they lost last year, it seemed to be more like, how are they going to replace Aaron Craft, who wasn't really an offensive player, an impact player on offense as much as he was on defense. And then D'Angelo Russell comes in, and he's making Shannon Scott look like the freshman. He looks like the senior guard, and I've just been really impressed by his play so far. It's hard to get a good gauge on Ohio State because they're one of those teams that doesn't schedule very difficult schedules for themselves in the non-conference area. No. But they've got a good game coming up this weekend in the CBS Sports Classic, and I'll be excited to see how D'Angelo Russell does. His only game against a major conference opponent so far, a difficult one, was Louisville, and that was a homecoming for him, and he had kind of a rough game, but I think he was pretty amped up for that one, and I'm willing to give him a pass on it.
Well, that's the thing. These guys are freshmen. It takes a while for them to sort of acclimate themselves to a high college level play, which is not something that Jahlil Okafor needed, but that doesn't mean that most freshmen don't. And when you look around the country, there's some very high-profile recruits that have not yet met that level of ability that we were talking about. Cliff Alexander springs to mind immediately. He's averaging barely 8 points, barely 6 rebounds a game. This is a guy who's supposed to come in and be the next in line behind either, take your pick of Andrew Wiggins or Joel Embiid in Kansas. And he's even masking even more of the struggles of Kelly Oubre, who's really been a role player for Kansas, hasn't really done anything significant that makes you stand up and say, oh, that's why he was thought of as a top 20 recruit. And it is about usage. It is about how much do teams need these guys to perform, because there are other players around the country. Miles Turner, the #2 overall recruit in the country, has stepped in at Texas and been their third leading scorer, third leading rebounder, and they don't even need him to start because they brought all 5 starters back. That's how good they are. A team like North Carolina brought in 2 top 10 players as well, in Theo Pinson and Justin Jackson. Both of those guys have behaved more like role players so far than stars, and certainly in the case of Jackson, Carolina needs him to score. He's not averaging double digits. So sometimes it's a combination of, are these guys ready? Is there a role for them to have? And then are they good enough to sort of step up and do it? And so far, I think you're right that D'Angelo Russell and maybe Rashad Vaughn and some of those guys are farther along, not just because of whatever their abilities are, but also the system that needs them to play that way.
Yeah, as you look at the best performing freshmen as far as scoring and offensive ability is, it's got to be those guys like Russell, and then you look at like Isaiah Whitehead at Seton Hall. He's really all that they've got. Melo Trimble at Maryland, after Des Wells went out, the scoring load kind of went to him. So yeah, I think those freshmen, like you said, it speaks more to their ability to step into a team that has a scoring void than just a good team. You look at Jahlil Okafor, and the more impressive thing that he's doing is it's not really a team that needs those points. They had an opening at center, and he stepped right into that. But they had guys like Quinn Cook, like Rashid Salomon, who are returning. Like, they would have been still a top 25 team without Okafor, and yet he steps in, he takes a huge number of their possessions, he's playing really efficiently, and clearly the best player in the country so far.
And Duke is using him differently. They play, for years now, they've been playing outside in primarily and getting by without a dominant big man. He's the best big man, the best true center that they've had in, going back to probably the Mike Krzyzewski's first dynasty in the 80s and early 90s, because he is that true post-up, low on the block, and bigger certainly than Elton Brand was, going back to a National Player of the Year, bigger than Sheldon Williams was, who was an All-American there. Okafor has been the real deal, and overshadowing guys like Justice Winslow and even Tyus Jones, who've been very good as freshmen for them too. They've been sort of average freshmen. If they were just the only 2 freshmen, we'd be saying, wow, Duke's got a couple of really good freshmen. It's only because Okafor is so dominant that we have to kind of readjust our calibrations of what makes for a truly dominant freshman player.
All right, Ted Keith, thanks for joining us on College Basketball 1-and-1. We'll be here all season long talking about a couple of big topics in college basketball each week. For SI.com, I'm David Gardner. Thanks for watching.